When a public broadcaster takes to the airwaves, the audience expects a certain level of distance from the day's politics. But behind the scenes of French public media, the inquiry reveals that some executives have come to view absolute neutrality as a mirage that stands in direct opposition to the law. The 1986 Leotard Law and the 2021 Republican Principles Law were written to ensure the nation's airwaves remain a shared utility, explicitly mandating political neutrality and pluralism for any service funded by the state. This document is the result of a formal parliamentary inquiry launched to see if those laws are being followed. Investigators exhumed the broadcast logs and guest lists to test the statutory mandate against the actual output of the networks. The inquiry centers on a specific tension. Millions of citizens are legally required to fund these networks through their taxes. But the evidence suggests a persistent gap between the fairness the law requires and the content that actually reaches the public. When the legal requirement for pluralism is set aside, a public service risks losing its status as a shared institution, drifting instead toward becoming a subsidized megaphone for a specific set of interests. The audit's first major focus was legacy radio, specifically the networks operating out of the Radio France building. Here, the data shows a stark disconnect between the general public and the network's actual audience. Look at this audit data from IFOP. It shows that 70% of the audience for France Inter, the nation's most listened-to station, votes for left-wing parties, a figure that far exceeds the national average for those same political groups. This skewed demographic is mirrored in the programming. AI analysis of the station's broadcast logs reveals a consistent overrepresentation of left-leaning chroniclers and guests, suggesting the audience skew is an outcome of the network's own editorial choices. The inquiry also heard testimony from former directors who described their mission as progressive. They rely on their own internal intuition to decide which voices are considered experts and which are left off the air entirely. The data points toward a public square that has been narrowed into a closed feedback loop. Millions of taxpayers are funding a system that effectively filters out the viewpoints of a massive segment of the population. Beyond legacy radio, the inquiry followed the budget into the digital space, specifically a €17 million project at France Televisions designed to engage a younger generation of viewers. This platform is called France.tv/. It targets the 15 to 35 age bracket, which means it carries a specific legal responsibility to ensure that content accessible to minors meets strict safety and educational standards. But the inquiry found that those protections were frequently absent. In one case, the platform aired content that highlighted the alleged benefits of using illicit hallucinogenic mushrooms. The content also moved toward active advocacy. The platform relayed militant fundraising campaigns and aired segments that appeared to validate the illegal destruction of public monuments during civil unrest. Perhaps most significantly, the inquiry flagged content promoting paid transgender pornography, with the platform directly advising its young audience to subscribe to explicit, paywalled sites. This goes beyond a simple question of editorial bias. It suggests that a state-funded mandate to educate and engage youth is being used to promote illicit acts and radicalize the very audience it was meant to serve. How does a platform funded by the state continue to air content that appears to violate both penal and broadcasting laws without intervention from the regulator, ARCOM? This diagram illustrates a cognitive framework called "What You See is All There Is." It describes how a person's field of vision can narrow until they lose sight of anything outside their immediate surroundings. Executives within this system often live in an ideological environment so uniform that they view their own progressivism as the objective, neutral center of society. To them, the bias isn't visible because there is no counterpoint in their field of view. During their testimony, executives defended the radical content found on the youth platform, claiming they assume everything they broadcast. They seem to view these controversial choices as a necessary part of their service. The real challenge to a fair national debate isn't just the content itself, it's this psychological blind spot. It leaves the architects of the system unable to recognize when their own perspective has drifted far from the public they serve. The inquiry's final audit connects the dots, from engineered radio demographics to €17 million digital platforms that prioritize activism over the protection of minors. When journalists and executives use their personal intuition to decide what the nation should hear, they risk alienating the millions of taxpayers who no longer see their own lives or values reflected in these institutions. A shared public square cannot exist if it is managed as a subsidized foreclosure of debate, where certain ideas are prioritized and others are systematically excluded by the people paid to be impartial. True impartiality isn't an impossible ideal, but it requires the public to hold the broadcast ledger accountable, checking the daily reality of the airwaves against the laws that govern them. As the 1986 neutrality law fades, we are left looking at the machinery deciding what the nation sees and hears every day. If the public is legally required to pay the bill for these airwaves, the public must also be the one to look past the executive defense and examine the raw